My thanks to everyone joining. We're just giving the webinar a moment to get everybody in, and we'll get started in just about 60 seconds. Thank you so much. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. Today, we're going to be talking about affordable access for GLP-1s. We appreciate everyone being with us today. I am Sarah Emond. I am ICER's President and Chief Executive Officer, and it's really a pleasure to be with all of you today. What we're going to do is a brief overview of the white paper that we just issued about affordable access to these new medicines. And then I am joined by an expert panel where we'll talk about what the policy options feasibility is, what makes sense, what doesn't, what combination of the options that we talk about today might make the most sense for ensuring affordable access to these medicines for patients. But first, a little bit of background. This white paper is the result of our policy leadership forum. Our PLF brings together a group of influential evidence leaders from payers, pharmacy benefit managers, purchasers, and life sciences companies. Each year, we develop a white paper based on one particular topic. The topic selection is sort of what's keeping you up at night. We really try to identify topics that we think a multi-stakeholder approach can help advance actionable policy. And so this year, it was how to pay for these GLP-1 medicines. But this is emblematic of a lot of the tension that we're going to be hopefully seeing, right? And I say hopefully because if we get a very effective treatment for Alzheimer's disease or another condition with a big population, we're going to be faced with this challenge again. So it's incumbent upon all of us to think about what policy options are viable and possible to lead towards affordable access for patients so that we don't make the same mistakes again in terms of not being able to get broad access to an effective therapy. So how did we come to create this paper? First, we did a targeted literature review. We looked at both peer-reviewed literature as well as gray literature, thinking about and talking about the use of these obesity medicines in the US. We also talked to experts, members of our policy leadership forum, as well as leaders from state and Medicaid departments, from benefit consultants, from advocacy groups and patients to get a well-rounded set of perspectives about the issue and the possible solutions. Through those conversations and our literature search, several themes emerged. So our job at ICER was to distill those themes down into several different buckets for further conversation. And I should say here, our thanks to Chris Whaley, our collaborator from Brown University, who helped us with this paper. Then we brought that draft paper to a 2-day conversation with the members of our policy leadership forum, as well as invited experts, to have an honest debate about the pros and cons, the opportunities and the challenges that some of these policy options represented. I want to thank everybody who participated in that meeting in Phoenix in December. I want to also call out how important it was that the energy and the attitude that we brought to that conversation was really productive. Here we are with an opportunity to give broad access to effective medicines for a population health challenge, but we have real affordability concerns that we need to navigate. This is sort of classic tension of our healthcare system right now. And again, my thanks to everyone who participated in that conversation for how it furthered and advanced the paper that we produced. A little bit of background, and then I'll give you an overview of the policy options that we determined were at least worth considering for many different stakeholders in the system. We know that obesity is a top public health priority, with over 40% of US adults having obesity and many having tried many different interventions, whether lifestyle interventions or other medicines, bariatric surgery. It still continues to be a challenge for many patients. This new class of obesity medicines offer weight reduction and associated benefits that, if they're sustained over time, have the potential to markedly improve population health. So what a tremendous opportunity that these new medicines represent. And while our own analysis looked at these drugs' value from a long-term perspective and found them to be cost-effective at their current net price, the rapid uptake and the sheer number of eligible patients is creating an affordability crisis. We've seen headline after headline of purchasers and health plans having to scale back coverage of these medicines because of the budget impact. And there are projections that if we had broad uptake of these medicines, it would represent $100 billion in US spending. Now, we could print more money, or we could talk about how we manage the introduction of these medicines in a way that meets a goal of affordable access, because we can't continue to sustain as a country health insurance premiums going up and up and up, right? So that's what we hear from stakeholders constantly. That's a real tension that we are facing. And so that's the context of talking about the different policy options today. What do we know about coverage? Well, it's a moving target. Don't trust any of the numbers on this slide because they probably changed in the last 15 minutes. So we know that Medicare currently covers GLP-1s for their use in diabetes and can reimburse GLP-1s if they're used for something related to cardiovascular disease, like preventing future heart attacks and strokes. But they are prohibited by law from covering the drug only for treating obesity. And I'll say here, it's actually treating weight loss. That's the statutory language that shows you how long ago that this statute was talking about these medicines, because we know now that they're not really weight loss drugs. These are drugs that address obesity. Medicaid, while typically required to cover every drug that has FDA approval, does not have to cover drugs for obesity, but some have chosen to. So the last count, again, probably changed in the last 15 minutes, 14 states are covering. That number is growing and retracting as states have struggled with the affordability of the medicines. And then on the commercial side, estimates vary. You usually see somewhere between a third and 40% of commercial lives have access to the GLP-1 medicines for obesity. We did talk with many different benefit consultants and purchasers. You see more generous coverage typically among larger firms, wealthier sectors of our economy, and those with more stable employee populations, meaning not a lot of turnover. That's typically descriptive of the type of employer who's offering coverage to GLP-1s for obesity right now. So it's a little bit of Swiss cheese, right? Well, here we're going to dive into some of the options that we identified through all of the conversations that we had from stakeholders and the literature review that we did. We bucketed these into both market strategies, things we think the market can do to ensure more affordable access to these medicines, and then we're going to talk about some federal actions. None of these is a silver bullet. There is no one solution here that will get us to that affordable access that we all want. I will also acknowledge, as I run through these, some of these don't feel great. And some of these don't feel great in isolation. They need to be paired with another one in order to get that achievement of affordable access. But let's just take these one at a time. Temporary coverage denial. No one loves this. But is it an option to not cover them? Well, yes, we've seen that from the uptake in the commercial market and what Medicare and Medicaid are doing. If you're faced with a budget constraint, one option is to not cover these for obesity. We intentionally call this temporary coverage denial because we do not think that this is a viable or ethical long-term solution for access to these medicines, because they are effective and they are going to deliver population health benefit. But you could imagine a particular purchaser waiting to expand coverage until there are market changes, whether it's competition, genericization. Those are the things that I think some purchasers are keeping an eye on as they consider this option. What we see more often is more prior auth and formulary management. Now, there's a lot of reasons that this is also tricky. We refer to our ethical considerations for how to do coverage policy, right? There's ways to do this based on the ethics of utilization management, and there's ways to do it that aren't consistent with those ethics. But if you are a purchaser trying to think about affordable access, you could narrow the population by limiting it to those with a higher BMI or those with comorbid conditions. You could require that this access to the medicine has to be paired with lifestyle management. We'll talk about that a little bit more in two other options, like the carve-out programs that exist. You could limit the duration of coverage to only 2 years, which is an experiment that's happening right now in the UK. Now, don't know what the evidence shows about that. Right now, we know most patients who discontinue regain the weight. So we want to look carefully about how limiting the duration of coverage could be applied. You could narrow coverage to a single GLP-1 in order to get a bigger discount on the other one. Or you could require patients try some of the older obesity medicines, knowing they're not as effective as the current generation, but they do work for some. And then you have the ability to save the use of the newer GLP-1s for those who don't respond to the earlier obesity medicines. Provider network management is also an option. And here, this can go one of two ways. You could have open prescribing, where any physician could prescribe the drug, but you pair it with formulary management and utilization management by limiting who can get access. You could go the other way, which is set to have very little utilization management, but the patient would have to be seen by an obesity specialist. Now, this is tricky because we have a lot more people with obesity than we do specialists trained to treat those with obesity. Or carving it out completely to a weight loss or obesity management firm, which we'll talk about in more detail in just a minute. Innovative payment arrangements. Now, for those who follow ICER, last year's policy leadership forum paper was on how to pay for gene therapies. And most of that paper was focused on these innovative payment arrangements. And while that makes a lot of sense in gene therapy, maybe not as much of an option here at this moment, but we put it out there. Performance arrangements saying you get money back if patients don't respond to the medicines, or you only pay for the medicines if patients respond. A subscription model similar to what was done in Louisiana and Washington for hepatitis C drugs. This gives purchasers budget certainty in exchange for as much drug as their members need. Or volume-based rebates. The more drug you buy, the bigger discount you get. Some of the nuances here have to do with the fact that we basically have two very effective obesity medicines right now. And so there are not as many options or opportunities for these innovative contract arrangements when you have a lot of demand and only two manufacturers. This is something to keep an eye on as we see more competition in the field. And then carve-out programs. This is one to watch. The data here are early and it's hard to draw any conclusions, but you will see a lot of companies representing that they're able to keep their GLP-1 spend down while still achieving weight loss for the population. So some of that is pairing it with lifestyle management and nutritional counseling. Some of it is using some of the older obesity medicines and reserving access to the newer medicines for those for whom those older medicines don't work. Very interesting to keep an eye on this. The data, again, pretty early stage, but there are a lot of purchasers that are considering this as an option to give affordable access to their members. Let's shift quickly now to the federal policy interventions. And as I warned everybody at the beginning, some of these are not really going to be that helpful in isolation, and it might be a combination of things, both in the federal silo as well as in the market-based silo. We could, if we're thinking about access here, improve access by making sure that Medicare can cover these drugs. This has been a moving target. One of our experts today is going to give us the latest, because that's one of the things that might have changed in the last 15 minutes, depending on how often you're hitting refresh on your news site of choice. But we know that Medicare and Medicaid, well, Medicare is prohibited and Medicaid does not have to cover it. We know there's been legislation, TROA, out there to expand access. We also know that the CBO scored that as being a bit expensive. So one of the other things we're starting to hear about is maybe a demonstration project through CMMI, the Center for Medicaid and Medicare Innovation. Could they be piloting access in some way to study how to do so in an affordable way for the Medicare population? Keeping an eye on this one. Also, if we're thinking about broad access, we went back and remember now that the 30 to 40% of commercial plans, that's a pretty low number covering drugs for obesity. What we could do is we could have the U.S. Preventative Service Task Force give these drugs an A or a B rating, which would mandate coverage from commercial insurance with no cost sharing. This is one of those ones where I said, remember, in isolation, this does one thing, that improves access. It doesn't do anything for the affordability. So this would need to be paired with some of the other market interventions in order to make it affordable for the healthcare system. Another one that could be late breaking at any minute as we think about some of the legal challenges that exist right now to the use of USPSTF to mandate certain things being covered. But we will keep an eye on what happens with that Supreme Court case. But this is a way that we would see broader coverage. Now, we also know that semaglutide, the active ingredient in Wegovy and Ozempic, is subject to IRA negotiation, CMS Medicare negotiation this year. The actual price won't be in effect until 2027, but by the end of November this year, we'll know what price the federal government negotiated for semaglutide. Now, there are minimum discounts that the Medicare has to achieve as part of the IRA. There is no floor. So would this be an opportunity for aggressive negotiation of a lower price in order to expand access and make access more affordable? That's anyone's guess, but it's definitely an option on the menu. And the other option on the menu that got a lot of enthusiasm from those at our Policy Leadership Summit was federal subsidies to support access for these drugs in the commercial market. Now, a lot of the benefits that we see from addressing obesity accrue many years in the future. So which payer is likely to receive a lot of that benefit? It's Medicare. So you could make a policy argument that subsidies from the federal government to help commercial insurers afford access actually is cost effective for the federal government. But here is where my snarky line of "have you met America lately" comes into play. Whether or not there's any political viability for this is a question we're all asking ourselves given our current environment, as is this last one. It exists in statute that the federal government can require that a particular drug be made by generic manufacturers in order to increase affordability and access. Again, political viability of this, questionable at best, but we always like to put forth a menu of options so that it gets policymakers and decision makers thinking about that entire spectrum of how to manage affordable access. And that's what we try to do with this paper. So, good news. We have 3 experts with us today who are going to tell us what to do. So as we move to the discussion part of our conversation today, I'm really thankful for having such wonderful experts who will be joining us. One other note, we were very thankful to Novo Nordisk, who participated and is a member of our Policy Leadership Forum. Their contributions to the Policy Summit, to edits and comments on the draft were immeasurable. Unfortunately, they were unable to join us today, but please know that their perspective has been reflected in the paper, even though ICER is the only one responsible for anything in that paper, but the input from Novo was really tremendous as we try to balance this affordability and access question for these new medicines. So let me ask the team to please come on camera now so that we can have our conversation. Maisha Draves is the Associate Executive Director at the Permanente Medical Group. Kim Lenz is the Chief Pharmacy Officer at Mass Health, which is the Medicaid department for Massachusetts. And Joe Naglowski is the President and CEO of the Obesity Action Coalition. And my thanks to all three for their participation today and their participation in developing this paper. Thank you guys so much for being here. All right, round robin, everybody. Do you have a favorite? Do you have one that you just think this is the best solution out there? I will allow, given the current environment, for your least favorite to come out in your conversation too, if that's important to you. But Joe, let me start with you. Do you have a favorite policy option that we've kind of put forth here for how
Well, I
we
think,
navigate
yeah,
this? Go ahead.
yeah, no, appreciate that, Sarah. Thanks for including me today and letting me represent the patient voice in this. And I think probably no surprise for those of you who know me and the work that I've done at OAC for the last 20 years that this Medicare coverage option for us is the number one priority. Of course, that includes some of the other options that you mentioned there, right? That includes the price negotiation aspect of this. That'll happen under the Inflation Reduction Act, and some of those activities are actually starting this week. We have patient advocates that are participating in that process this week. They're the town that's all done privately, but with the agency. But then starting next week, there's a public hearing around that. But then I also think that, when I think about, as you talked about the combination of these things, I think it is going to take what we call utilization management with wisdom, right? And utilization management with evidence, right? Combined with that coverage. I'll be pretty bold here. I've been doing this work 20 years, and it was 13 years ago that we asked Medicare to start covering these medicines. And honestly, at that time, there were no new medicines, right? GLP-1s were, not in people's minds yet around obesity. And we had a few small companies developing agents that, are kind of now considered the second generation of obesity medicines. But the main medicine was a $10 a month medicine, phentermine, right? If we had created coverage all those years ago, if I'd done my job better all those years ago, and we actually created that coverage, would we be in a different situation today? We never predicted, as part of our work around TROA, that medicines would ever exceed $200 a month. And part of me goes back, hindsight's 2020, but if we had gone back all those years ago and done that, would we live in an era today where these medicines were more affordable and priced more reasonably? Of course, it doesn't always help for us to look back, but worth acknowledging, right? That there's work that we probably missed an opportunity all those years ago to put us not in the situation we are in today.
I appreciate the clarity of both looking back and looking forward, because there are things that we can learn. You should let yourself off the hook a little bit. There are a lot of other things that have happened in the intervening 13 years that might have made that a challenging reality too. Kim, let me go to you. If you have a favorite policy option as you think about this menu.
I mean, I feel, well, thanks for having me. I appreciate being here, especially on this panel with all the speakers you have. But I feel like I'm pressed to say that my favorite has to be the one that we took, because as I get into in my comments, I'll have to get a little bit more into that. But I think, as you mentioned in your earlier comments, Sarah, the paper does demonstrate that there's long-term value here, but we have a sustainability issue in the short term. And so for us at Mass Health, utilizing our partnership with the manufacturers to get the lowest net price allowed us to have the most open access that we could. So I know there's pros and cons to having a single preferred, but our goal was to align our criteria with the broadest access to help the most number of patients. And so for us, at the time, it really was using a single preferred. And as you said, it moves every 15 minutes. So given that you made the paper a little bit ago, we also have now incorporated use of some of the older agents, including phentermine, as a trial when appropriate for patients. We can't force it on everyone, but for those who the provider feel that it's an okay trial, we do ask that be tried to try to also reduce the total cost in this class.
Thank you, Kim. I wrote down utilization management with wisdom because, Joe, I'm going to start using that because I think that's right. I think there are options here where older medicines, narrowing the population can make a lot of sense when it's clinically sound. But how you write that in a way so that you are not making Maisha's life terrible is really, really important. And so, Maisha, to you, as you think about the options that we've laid out and the challenges that you're facing at Kaiser, tell us a little bit about how you feel about your favorite among these policy options.
Thank you so much. I think that where Joe and Kim hit the nail on the head is that really any one selected has to consider the price itself. And so, Medicare price negotiation or needing to directly negotiate with the manufacturer for a single medication, which allows for better pricing. And I think it's a really interesting topic to consider, a rule that's really not been used much before that, there is an allowance that the GLP-1s can be manufactured by generic companies. And that really we start pushing at that level. You'll hear more in my comments that, the price doesn't have to be this high. We can manufacture it for a fairly small amount of dollars. And I think so many of the other options really continue to keep the prices high and find other ways along the chain to mask the high prices that I think at this point, really addressing more directly, maybe our best way forward for our patients, our healthcare system, and our United States GDP, just being able to afford healthcare for the entire U.S. population.
Misha, I appreciate that. And I do want to make sure we'll talk about price some more. I know it's going to come up in some of the comments that we're planning to hit on. And I will, given we weren't able to have an innovator join us today, offer for our consideration that we want to balance the signal that we send to manufacturers to innovate and swing for the fences and do really good things for patients with their medicines, reward that in innovation through price, and then a balance of the affordability. So just so you know that tension's kind of through all of our thoughts today and all of the policy options, that we don't want to make it so that when manufacturers invest the time and energy to produce something that's really good for patients, there is some sort of reward for that in our innovation system. So we're going to unpack that a little bit more. Joe, I'm going to you next. You touched on this a little bit, but given that it is a moving target, I know this audience would really appreciate an update on where we are on the federal policy landscape. What are we expecting from this administration or just from policy generally in terms of expanding access to these medicines?
Yeah, thanks, Sarah. And I think many people who are watching this probably know that at the end of the Biden administration and some last-minute rulemaking, they actually proposed that Medicare and Medicaid cover obesity medicines, not just specifically GLP-1s, but all obesity medicines moving forward. Unfortunately, and probably not unexpectedly, the Trump administration has chosen not to move forward with that at this time. However, there's been some signals, including by the Secretary of HHS himself, that they are going to relook at this issue. And again, as I said before, it is not uncommon with last minute rulemaking that the next administration just simply doesn't follow that. And honestly, we think the administration made a serious effort to actually evaluate that, did some of the meetings and did all of that. So maybe there is this potential moving forward that the Trump administration will move forward with something innovative around this space, whether that is reintroducing the rule or, as you suggested in your opening presentation, considering a CMMI demonstration project around this area. The other thing that will happen in parallel, and this will happen here in the next month or two, is likely we will see the reintroduction of the Treat and Reduce Obesity Act, which is the legislation that would actually do two things. One, it would require the coverage of obesity medications, again, clarifying that old language that exists in a Medicaid statute that got applied to Medicare that says agents for weight loss, weight gain, or anorexia are not covered, right? And it would actually fix that part of it. It would also actually expand access to counseling, which we think is important, right? And we've talked about that earlier about how we need to wrap around the care around people with who are using medicines for obesity. There's always this combination of behavioral therapy and medicines that go hand in hand. And so that's kind of where we are right now. But I will say, as you mentioned, there are, I think, in 38 states activity going around now around Medicaid or state employees or coverage in states as well. So as you mentioned earlier, it is a day-to-day fight around this, and there's lots of advocacy moving forward. And of course, the fundamental question around all of this is we are no longer having to convince policymakers that these are necessary, right? And that these are evidence-based. It is all around this conversation of cost, right? And that's why we participate in panels like this one today and talk about all these different options, right? Because we, our policymakers are looking for strategies to say, hey, how can we manage to afford these in the current environment?
Thank you, Joe. So Maisha, I also think this audience would appreciate hearing how you've tried to tackle this as an integrated health system. So Kaiser gets looked to for solutions all the time, given its unique structure of being an integrated provider organization. So why don't you share a little bit about what challenges this has represented and some of the solutions that you are trying?
Thank you. So, I think it goes to what Joe is discussing. You really need to have it around a program, support and structure. A medication alone is usually not a silver bullet. Trying other medications first that can be effective is an option in as our physicians take care of our patients. In addition, learning what the patient's goals are. Phentermine and phentermine plus topiramate can get a 9 to 10% weight loss, especially in a structured program, if it's the right medication for that person and safe. And really, as Joe said, it's about $10. And so, many can achieve the goal that they desire without hurting their pocketbook to a point where they're having to make choices on other parts of their life in order to achieve those results. So I'd say really looking at the menu of medication offerings and the support structure, whether that be with diet or exercise, coaching. Those are really a lot of the mainstays that we implement at this time. As well as really selecting the right patient and really talking about an off ramp. When will you be sustaining the pathway of diet, exercise, lifestyle changes that staying on the medication long term, you may be able to sustain some of those results coming off of the medication. So I think from a clinical point of view, that's the type of care and delivery that we offer to our members.
Thank you. I think this question of right patient and who needs to be on it potentially forever and who doesn't are some of the things that are keeping us up nights as researchers, knowing that with any medicine, there's a heterogeneity in treatment effect. We know this, and that not everyone responds the same way or needs it for the same reason. And so I think many of us are interested in what kind of data we can produce to know the right patient at the right time and for how long. Thank you, Maisha. So Kim, our white paper touches a little bit on the approach that Mass Health has taken. For those who haven't had a chance to read every word of our paper, why don't you give an overview of the sort of the questions you were and the challenges you were trying to answer and the solutions that you found to being one of the 14 states to expand access?
Sure. Yeah. So we started covering for obesity medications January of 2024. As many of you will probably recall, during that time, there were massive shortages of some of these agents. So right as we started to open those gates, we saw a whole lot of starting, stopping, flipping back and forth to different agents. And just to be truthful, I think in the first 6 months, it was really hard to kind of understand where people were going to fall. And you couldn't tell if the stopping of the claims was because they had an adverse event, they weren't seeing the weight loss, or because of the shortages. So I really look at 2024 as really coming into picture in the second half. Maybe second quarter, we started to see a little bit of dry up of the shortages, and we started to see where patients would land. At that point, we had planned with our actuaries, with the manufacturer. Our preferred agent at that time was Wegovy, so we were working very closely with Novo to understand kind of what the uptake would look like. We created a dashboard to understand how many patients were new starts month over month. We were tracking their outcomes, both on the primary metric of weight loss and secondary metrics. And it became very clear early on that we were going to far surpass any expectation of uptake. So in the second half of the year is where we had to really reconsider what our approach was going to be. And so we reopened negotiations and said, effective 1/1, we are going to have a single preferred again. The lowest net cost to the Commonwealth will be the preferred agent. And I know in the white paper, Sarah, you lay out the pros and cons of doing that, which is totally fair. But, as a reminder, in the Medicaid front, we are using taxpayer dollars and federal subsidies to pay for medications. So at the end of the day, we have two very good products out on the market. And so that's the approach we took. And we ended up going with Lilly for 1/1. And we started opening access in October so that we could work with providers to make the switch. One of the things you highlight in the white paper as being a challenge with the single preferred is being able to flip the utilization. What we did to do that is sent thousands of targeted letters to providers who had prescribed for a patient. We let them know of the runway we had created with Lilly's partnership to onboard them. And so we started to slowly see the trickle in. We worked with providers. We contacted the top 10 providers to walk them through everything that they needed and sent letters to all of the members to alert them to the changes. And we put behind the scene prior authorizations in place for patients to help minimize the PA burden. And by doing that, we did see a very significant flip to our preferred product.
What I appreciate about that approach, Kim, it touches on a few of the things that we highlight in our another white paper that came from our policy leadership forum about the ethical considerations for fair access to drugs. And it's about the policy being evidence-based, about communication, about not making it too onerous. And, one of the things that's interesting, as I've observed in this space, is that, and Joe referenced even the language that was used in the statute that said, you can't cover this for Medicare, weight loss, anorexia drugs. We've learned so much about what this is. And we have a lot of changes that we are making as a society about how we think about obesity as a chronic condition. But we know that there are some medicines out there, and Maisha mentioned this too, about thinking about the appropriate patient. I know, I'll share this other quick anecdote. A member, someone at the policy leadership forum said, as a primary care physician, I don't usually get people showing up asking me to go on a statin, but I do have people showing up asking to go on one of these new medicines. And that creates some tension because there are some older medicines that work. And so we do talk about that a little bit in the utilization management piece. But Joe, thinking from the patient perspective, how do you talk about this issue of some of the older medicines that out there that might actually work for some patients? And then we can reserve the newer medicines while they're still on brand for patients for whom those other medicines don't work.
Yeah, Sarah, you're speaking to my heart a little bit here because as someone who's been actively treating my obesity for 30 years, and by the way, never once during those 30 years has my insurance covered any of the treatments that I have received. I am now on my 6th medicine to treat my obesity. So all the medicines we've talked about, I have tried, right? And it wasn't now on my 2nd GLP-1, by the way. So, and that was solely for cost purposes, because again, paying out of pocket for these things. Is the reality of that some of these medicines work for some people and other people they do not, and they will have to move on to some of these. And I will remind folks that it is, we're having this conversation now because of the popularity of the GLP-1s, but 5 years ago I was asking every payer to cover these older medicines. And they still said no then when these drugs were $10 or $99 or whatever it may be. And it's a challenge to me. I also will challenge any of you who are on right now and are doing this. I mean, if you're requiring a prior authorization for a $10 a month phentermine prescription, you're just creating barriers for the sake of creating barriers, right? And so we have to acknowledge that there are some things that we can do. And again, back to my utilization management with wisdom, like, do we need to be prior authing some of these very inexpensive generic medicines that are available that people could use and then move forward here? And so I just want to, I mean, not to be a skeptic around some of this, but I think that the fact that every payer doesn't cover these inexpensive older generation obesity medicines is a bit of a symptom of the bias that we have around obesity, right? Where people again assume this is just about weight loss and it's not about health, right? I will be honest with you. I mean, as someone who's again tried 6 medicines, have been in more than a dozen behavioral programs in my lifetime, this was never for me about cosmetics or appearance. This was about health. And I am healthier today because of these medicines. In fact, almost all my health issues have resolved because of these medicines. And so, worth acknowledging that that's the, part of our system is, we can talk about access to GLP-1s as part of this, but if you're not actually offering at least basic access to the older medicines, your organization is part of the problem. So, to be frank.
Yeah, Joe, I appreciate that. No, we're here to be frank, right? So I know that the stigma and the societal perspectives on this have woven themselves into policies and to decisions that we've made. So, to me, an upside of having this conversation, because there's increased demand, we've got more effective treatments than we've had in the past, is being able to say that part out loud, and that where we've had bias and stigma intersect with and prevent utilization management with wisdom, it's worth calling out. So I really appreciate you doing that. Joe, I'm going to just stick with you on one other issue that's related. So you touched a little bit on how that can present an access barrier. What other access barriers are you hearing from the community? I think the slide about the Swiss cheesiness of the coverage policy sums that up. But I also, if you would, fascinated by what they're now calling this farm to table movement of sort of the direct to consumer approach, and just how your community is reacting to that. I think this audience would appreciate hearing.
Yeah, so I mean, obviously, I'm very interested in alternative methods to provide obesity care because many of us who live with obesity have had such bad experiences in our primary care environment around this issue. And so we're always interested in these ideas. But for me, what's lacking currently in this kind of environment where you go online and you fill out a form and maybe you have a virtual appointment or maybe you don't. And some are super comprehensive. They're sending you scales and nutrition programs and interacting with you daily, and others they're just sending you a medicine, is we're lacking this link back to primary care, right? So my obesity care, I still have to engage with my primary care provider to be able to adjust all the other medicines moving forward. And this is a warning, right? Because I know it is one of the options that we put in the paper, right? That you can in effect carve out this care and send it somewhere else. And I would just offer a bit of a warning around that, right? Because obesity care is not just about taking a GLP-1 and giving nutrition advice. It's also about managing all the other health conditions that are associated with the obesity. And if you're not doing that part as part of your carve-out program, but sending them back to primary care, you're just creating another burdensome experience for the patient, right? I know firsthand from someone who's long well cared by their primary care provider, who actually is also an obesity medicine specialist, who is now being required by their insurance, their large employer insurance, to go to a carved out program for their obesity care. And it's like, but this person's super successful and doing everything right, and their health has improved dramatically. And by the way, they've been on the medicine long term. Why are you sending them off to this other program, creating those kind of burdens? And I just worry there'll be some consequences around that, about us, in effect, taking away this idea that we should have a primary care home that actually is responsible for all of our health. And so that's my fear around those programs. I understand the necessity for short-term cost management and things along those lines, but I am worried that the short-term cost management you're gonna miss a opportunity for long-term cost savings because you're creating these extra layers.
It keeps me up at night a little bit too, Joe, just because, and this isn't just for the obesity question, but I was in a meeting recently that was talking about primary care physicians should be doing more cognitive baseline screening in order to help manage patients who may eventually develop Alzheimer's disease. And I was like, wow, we keep asking our primary care teams to do a whole lot, and we're not giving them a lot more support or money to do that. And we see a lot of people leaving primary care. And so what I worry about is, yes, the disjointed care, but then also we're not in a system that's actually rewarding all of this being in a medical home, and it should be. And I will say that I think primary care physicians should make a lot more money than they do. I'll put that out there. But keeping with the theme of keeping you up at night, Maisha, as you think about what you're trying to accomplish for your patients while managing the affordability, what are the big issues that are keeping you up at night on this one?
Yeah, so I think two angles. One from the clinical point of view is, you know, selecting the right medication for the patient, making sure they have a wraparound service to be successful with the medication that they choose, and then being able to afford it long term. And I know price isn't necessarily on the table, but it's the beginning of all affordability and access. So yes, the medication of GLP-1 is high quality. We've been using it for 20 years. There is a lot known about its safety. The new double doses, we are learning more about its safety as well. I will put that caveat. And where we struggle right now is access and affordability. And I think that's still what keeps us up at night. As a primary care doctor, I want to offer the best to a patient. As a healthcare integrated system, where we have our primary care doctors, our specialists, our surgeons, our hospitals, and our insurance all integrated in one, we live and breathe a home medical team. Carving this out and asking a patient to manage this on their own, and sometimes with a simple form, a telehealth and a mailed medication, and without the proper support, can be quite tricky. And then knowing how that integrates back into the rest of their care. But it really comes back to price. In 2007, semaglutide cost $200. It was approved in 2005, 20 years ago. So the R&D costs, as you mentioned, really innovation, research development has been accomplished. Now the medication is over $1,000. In the farm to table, direct to consumer, it's still $4.99 a month. Compounding companies really showed it could be made for less than $5 in a recent JAMA article, and that there are plenty of profits for a manufacturer at a price of, $199 or $200 back at the 2007 prices. And so, with 320 patents on semaglutide, 54% of them about the device, not about the active ingredient that we're even talking about that is helpful. I wonder if research development as an argument and innovation as an argument is past due at this point. 320 patents later, 20 years later, most working on the device itself rather than the medication. And when Novo has really spent more than 41% over research and development on really buybacks instead. And so at this point, they still have a patent out until 2031 or 2032. That's another 5 years and estimated at another $166 billion in profits. I think when you balance access and affordability, patients, and our entire healthcare system, the manufacturers can still have a healthy profit without hurting patients and without hurting the entire healthcare system and integrated care to deliver what all of our patients want and need.
We were here to have real conversation. Maisha, thank you. I mean, I think that perspective is shared by many, and I think it's a valid contribution to the conversation about sort of what we pay, how much we pay for things at what point in their life cycle. My more optimistic take on what we've seen with the introduction and the success of tirzepatide and semaglutide is, wow, the pipeline for additional medicines is pretty robust. And wouldn't it be great if this ends up looking a lot like hepatitis C, where launched at a high price, and challenges for affordability that were then addressed by prices coming down. And I will put forth that I'm hoping for a Hep C example here and not a rheumatoid arthritis example, where competition actually just had prices go up. And so let's keep an eye on that. And let's all, I think we're all capitalists here. We're looking for a market solution. That's an ideal solution here. And the price is potentially coming down with competition, but we'll keep an eye on that for sure. Kim, shifting to you and thinking about this sort of, the choices that different payers and purchasers are making and the challenges they face with only 14 Medicaid departments choosing, as a leader in the Medicaid space, why do you think it's been hard for Medicaid departments to think about offering access to these medicines given their effectiveness?
I don't I don't think that it has anything to do with questioning the efficacy of the drug.
Right.
I think at this point, Medicaid programs around the country are facing extremely tough financial times. We have no cost share. We have no premium shifts. So it becomes a financial equation. And, even in Massachusetts, where I think we're pretty blessed in terms of resources that we have and centers of excellence that we have, we're looking at an incredibly tough fiscal year ahead. That coupled with the fact that at the federal level, there will be Medicaid cuts to the tune of over $800 billion over the next decade. It's really hard to understand, what we're going to have to spend on all of this. As we watch every month the PMPM increase in this class, and as you've pointed out in your white paper, in the long term, we should see cost offset. And Joe's a great example of explaining that too. In the short term, that's actually not at all what you see. And so it's very hard to make a picture that presents that, the cost offset in the short and the long is the right move, even though clinically, I think we all agree. So it really becomes just a financial equation. And I think for the states that haven't expanded yet, this is a darn near impossible time to ask them to do that, given the financial pressures at the federal level. It makes it almost impossible. With federal match at risk for various things and the uncertainty there with some of the executive orders, I don't think we're going to see a ton of movement in the near future.
Kim, thanks. What it reminds me of is one of the core tenets that we try to bring to any conversation at ICER, which is none of these decisions are being made in a vacuum, and that all of these decisions have both positive and potentially negative impacts on other things. And we talk a lot about opportunity cost. And when we spend on something, it means often we can't spend on something else. And I received some direct feedback when we put out our paper a couple of weeks ago about how we didn't do enough to emphasize that these are high value from a long-term perspective, and so we should just find the money. Not one of the people who contacted me gave me an example of where we're going to find the money, right? So this becomes the challenge of knowing that we know that there's low value care and there's ways for it to be, sure, it's out there, but identifying places to come up with the resources for this, just a reminder that that's why we have tension on this issue. And if we didn't have that tension, we wouldn't be needing to have a white paper or a conversation about it today. And so Kim, thanks for laying that out so well. What I'd love to give you each is a minute or two, 3, I'm getting close, but you can have a couple. What is something that you want to ask someone else in the ecosystem to do that gets us to affordable? access. It can be directed at a particular part of the ecosystem. It can be directed at yourself if you want to do a little of that. Maybe it's like your new mantra for 2025. But just what are you thinking of? Like, this is what I wish would change, because it would make such a big difference in getting to affordable access. Joe, let me start with you.
So I think the big thing for me is a little more transparency in the process. And I know you've tried to cut through that, Sarah, with the work that you do and some of the things that we move here. But, I look at the examples of, okay, people say these are awfully expensive and utilization is super high, yet I don't see a lot of transparency around what are the real costs and what savings really exist. And I think if we want to have an honest conversation about price, we have to be transparent about it, right? So, you know, okay, so I can afford to pay $500 per month out of pocket to afford my medicine. But if my insurance did cover it and I have a high deductible health plan, if they're charging me $1,200 a month for the first 5 months because my deductible is $6,000, they're also getting a rebate during that time. And then after that, they're charging me 20%. And actually, if you calculate that rebate, and I have no other health issues now because my medicines have helped me solve that, they're actually making money when they're actually taking in more money than they're actually spending on my medicines, right? Kind of thing. Now, that's I mean, not everyone is going to be me, right? But I think we have to have some of these transparent conversations about what that may be. And I realize I'm asking that we break the system, because the system is really the challenge in this place. And then my final comment, and I said it earlier, and I just think it's important. I would ask that if this was any other disease, would we be having the conversations we're having now, and would you be responding the same way? Because look, there was a JAMA piece that came out, letter just came out about 2 weeks ago, that showed we're spending, again, pre-rebate, somewhere around $50 billion annually around on GLP-1 class medications across the entire class, but only 10% of that was actually for obesity. 90% of it is for diabetes. So we're having this conversation today about covering these for obesity, but we're not talking about the diabetes side of this, and we're not having those same conversations there. And so why are we having that difference? Is that bias rising into this conversation, and do we need to overcome that to actually have that transparency and then really have this conversation?
Love the call for transparency. Live in that world too, all the time. A fun fact that some have heard me say before: in our early days, ICER did its work. We compared the cost effectiveness of the new drug versus the list price of the medicine, because that's all we had access to. And we got a lot of feedback. They're like, well, you should be comparing it to the net price because that's a better representation. And when we've asked for net price, we have never received it. And so now we use an outside firm that helps us estimate it. So we've been living that transparency piece for a long time. Maisha, what is your ask of someone in the ecosystem?
Thank you. And I would say, Joe, to your point, this is for diabetes and obesity that this ask comes. But it's really about patent reform. I think that at the current pace of patents, patent thicketing, pay for delay, what we're really doing is blocking innovation, blocking competition, and blocking access and affordability. And so I think that, if we really look at the tactics of pay for delay, patent thicketing, we're really at a point where we're blocking innovation. We're blocking the ability for competition to come to market. And it really has the manufacturers focusing on minor modifications that make no meaningful difference to the delivery of the care or the treatment, to continue to focus on exclusivities. And so if that same energy were used on the next generation of medications or different disease states, I think the entire healthcare ecosystem would benefit much more. So I really do call for a patent reform as a way to really help us all move forward and away from these tactics.
Transparency, patent reform. Kim, what's your ask of someone in the ecosystem?
Yeah. So I would echo what Maisha said and what Joe said as well. But I think for manufacturers, for something that hasn't been said, please come to the table to work with payers. We're trying our darndest to either provide the benefit or to save keeping the benefit. So please, think about innovative contracts that you are able to offer. To the providers, please try to identify the patients who are really going to benefit from these drugs versus, as we've talked about, there are other drugs, a combination phentermine topiramate, that may be appropriate for patients. Somebody has pre-diabetes, maybe is there another GLP-1 that's lower cost that could be used, versus really reserving these to the patients who truly need them. And I think to the payers, for those of you who haven't expanded, I get it. For those of you who have, please gather all the data you can. I know we have like a dashboard on all of this, and I hope that we're able to continue the benefit in a way that allows me to publish that data and show long-term outcomes. But I think try to save the benefit, try to keep it, and let's put out as much data as we can.
I will echo that, Kim. I was going to make a call for as much transparency in the data as we possibly can tolerate, because we need to know for whom these drugs are most appropriate and for whom they're not. We need to know if there are patients who can discontinue or not. We have so many questions that will help us reach the goal of affordable access. My big call to action is for more data, please. You have all been generous with your time to spend an hour with me and with this audience talking about this really important issue. I'm so incredibly grateful for your perspectives. Thank you to our audience for sticking with us for an hour. The recording will be available. You can share it with your friends or use it to help fall asleep at night if that's what you need to, when you have some insomnia. But with joking aside, my thanks to the ICER team that worked on this paper and the Policy Leadership Forum, to all of the members of the Policy Leadership Forum and those who attended our summit. Thank you for participating in this really important conversation. Thank you all.
Thanks for having us.